Hang tight. We're live. Okay. Hello. This is the Free Thought Blogs chat line here, I think. And right now, who I've got with me is Matt Heron, who is of the blog Fierce Roller, and he's going to tell us what that's all about.
Well, thank you. Thanks for chatting with me. Mainly, I blog about evolutionary biology. My specific interests are in the evolution of multicellularity. And just as with my research, the main thing I write about there as a model organism is the green alga Volvox and its unicellular and multicellular relatives. And I delve into some other topics as well. Sometimes the temptation to bash creationists gets the best of me, and so I write responses to some of the things that they write. And I try to keep up with a little bit of the philosophy of biology literature, mainly about what constitutes a biological individual, because it's a topic that comes up all the time when you're thinking or talking about the evolution of multicellularity. It's a natural question to say at what point does a group of cells become an individual in its own right? So those are the main things I write about.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I just got to tell you that, we've been doing this thing where we go to Lake Itasca with our incoming students and we do some sampling, and the students are always utterly thrilled to see Volvox.
Yeah,
It's
they're
a
amazing
very
to see.
pretty orb. Yeah, it's spectacular. So let me ask you though, there was big news a while back from the University of Minnesota, of all places, where they'd been working on a model of the evolution of multicellularity in yeast.
Uh-huh.
What did you think of that stuff?
Well, full disclosure, the lead author on that work, Will Ratcliffe, is a close friend and colleague of mine who's now here at Georgia Tech.
Uh-huh.
And we have written grants together and co-authored papers together. So there's my bias. It really was Will's work that got me into the experimental evolution of multicellularity. He did it with yeast, and we're doing it now with this unicellular green alga, Chlamydomonas. So the short answer is I'm a big fan of that work. It really inspired my current work.
Uh-huh. Yeah. No, I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, the concern was always that, well, this is kind of an artificial system. You're working with yeast. They're just kind of glomming together. Does this really count? Does this really count? They were described, what was it, some apoptosis in these colonies. And is that sufficient to call that specialization? So I know there were some reservations out there, but it looked pretty cool to me. And why should we be surprised when we discover that multicellularity evolves fairly easily?
Oh, that's a great question. People have argued for a long time about how it happens and how all these various things have to come together. And I think there's been sort of a natural assumption that it has to be difficult. But, um, and maybe it is difficult to evolve a complex multicellular organism with lots and lots of cell types and tissues and maybe even organs, because that hasn't happened very many times. But Rick Grossberg has a paper where he argues basically what we've found, which is that at least the initial steps towards a multicellular lifestyle really aren't that difficult. It's happened lots of times that we know of, at least a couple of dozen times, and probably more because in a lot of cases these things don't leave any fossil record. So I think it is surprising compared to what people thought 5 or 10 years ago that multicellularity evolves so easily. But now we've seen it in several of these experiments, and in a lot of cases, it happens within just a few hundred generations, where you're getting these very simple multicellular structures. I don't want to call them organisms because that's sort of begging the question.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I was just reading earlier about, some of Eugene Koonen's stuff on this, and he's got this model of a Darwinian eigen transition, which is once you reach a certain threshold, and selection can take over and start pushing a new paradigm, it can happen pretty quickly. And I think that applies to what you're saying about the evolution of multicellularity, is that selection, once it gets going, is a pretty powerful force, and it can drive it in all kinds of interesting directions.
Yeah, and we think from some modeling work and really just from sort of evolutionary logic that that a couple of things are really crucial, namely clonal development, because that's how almost all multicellular organisms, at least the ones that have evolved any high degree of complexity, evolve clonally. That means that all their cells are basically genetically identical. And a single cell bottleneck seems to be really important too for similar reasons. It sort of ensures that, sort of resets whatever genetic variation may have arisen over developmental time back to zero, back to genetic identity among all the cells.
Yeah. Yeah, I also remember several years ago, I attended a talk by Billy Swallow, and she was talking about these colonial tunicates,
Mhm.
and raised some very interesting questions about what is the nature of the individual, because
Yeah.
in these tunicates, you can have two individuals that colonize a rock at roughly the same time, for instance. And what will happen is that one may invade and slowly, gradually take over the other individual. And before you know it, the other individual sitting there looks the same, but its cells have all been replaced by
Oh well.
its neighbor, um, which sounds like a great plot for a science fiction movie. Okay,
Yeah.
but otherwise, yeah, it's a really weird and complicated thing. That what exactly is an individual, especially when you start saying, well, we can replace all the genetics of the cells of this individual with another individual's, and is it still the same individual? Mm.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean,
Yeah,
it really is sort of a subfield of philosophy of biology. There's meetings and entire books devoted to this topic endlessly about what constitutes an individual.
right. Yeah. And people say philosophy is not important for biology. You just kind of
Yeah,
baseball and say, wait a minute, do you understand the questions we're asking? That this is stuff where philosophy is really, really important.
yeah, I think that attitude is just fundamentally misguided.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned some of your creationist stuff earlier. And yeah, that's the same thing where even if you're not a creationist, there are people who are constantly looking for simple answers to complex problems. And what happens is this kind of stuff where people dismiss all the philosophy, when philosophy is actually talking about stuff that's right at the core of what evolutionary biology should be addressing. And you can't simply wave it away. You have to think about these questions.
Yeah, I mean, they come up naturally when you're thinking about, um, the evolution of multicellularity is one of these so-called major transitions that include things like the endosymbiotic origin of eukaryotes and the evolution of eusociality in lots of different animal groups. And anytime you're thinking about those kinds of transitions, the question about, in a lot of cases, we don't really question that a human being is an individual, and we don't really question that our unicellular ancestors were individuals. So at some point, we had to cross over, not necessarily a threshold, but at least through some gray area before which we considered the cells individuals, and after which we considered the group of cells the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And so anytime you're talking about that, that question always comes up.
Yeah, and I'm kind of plagued by it too, because I come from two interlinked disciplines. I'm both a neuroscientist and a developmental biologist. And this problem comes up in neuroscience all the time too, because what is the individual consciousness? And I think the consensus among most neuroscientists is that there isn't one, that you've got a whole bunch of operating modules in your head, and you can be a different person from day to day, with a core of commonality, of course, but that there are different influences that can change things. And then, of course, as a developmental biologist, we're constantly thinking about developmental transitions. Am I the same person I was when I was 12 years old?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is the butterfly the same individual as the caterpillar that?
Oh yeah. Metamorphosis. That's another freaky phenomenon.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, when you start poking around the edges, you start to realize that the that most organisms don't fit our sort of canonical idea of what an individual is. Like a genetically homogeneous, spatially bounded organism that's all like a vertebrate. You start looking outside of the vertebrates, it seems like almost everything has some kind of complication to that picture. Whether there's multiple genetically identical individuals or genetic heterogeneity within individuals or whatever. And it turns out that the sort of canonical case is really the rarity across the tree of life.
Yeah, we keep seeing exceptions to that canonical system as well. I mean, right now it's really hot to talk about the microbiome and so forth, and ask, what really constitutes the organism in this case, because we're clearly made of disparate species all functioning together. And if you wipe one out, you've got problems. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, in some cases, those kind of symbioses are obligate. Like one or the other partner can't live without the other one at all.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the bacteria that are living in our guts are not simply wild bacteria that you can just poop out and they thrive anywhere. They like being inside of you. You're providing things they need, and so it's a kind of mutualism that's very important to us.
Yeah. And we like having them for lots of reasons.
Yes, when they get disrupted, we get very unhappy. Yes.
Sure.
Okay, let me ask you one last question. And here's the thing: we're a couple of nerdy scientist types. Free Thought Blogs has also got this commitment to social justice
I think
and
I lost
equality. Where do you feel like you fit in on the spectrum? Uh-oh. Did you just freeze on me?
I can hear you again.
Okay, good. It was just a momentarily delay. Okay.
But I missed your question, or I missed the beginning of the question.
Oh, so it's about this other side of Free Thought Blogs, which is about social justice. Where do you fit in on that?
Where do I fit in?
Yes. Are you one of those terrible liberals or something?
Yeah, I'm a terrible liberal. I'm a godless heathen. I don't write too much about that. It's not because I don't feel passionately about it, just because that hasn't been what I've had the time and set up the blog to write about. But yeah, I mean, I feel strongly about those issues. I'd have to know, what specific issue you're talking about to make a sweeping generalization.
Yeah, it's I sometimes feel uncomfortable with it too, because I started out as a science blogger, of course, and that's what I'm really interested in. But at the same time, I'm constantly feeling this, that one of the big problems in science right now is the injustice that's done, for instance, to women and minorities. that we need everyone on deck to do this stuff. And so I've increasingly dedicated more and more of my sparse amounts of time on the blog to, let's fix this. Let's recognize that there are inequalities and there's problems. But of course, this is not a requirement for being here. It's, as long as you're simpatico with kind of our general philosophy here, we're not concerned, because we don't monitor what everyone writes. So do
Well,
your
on
thing.
that, on that issue in particular, that the issue of sort of women in academia and sexism in academia, that's something where my thinking has really evolved over the last 5 or so years. I think, the things I thought 5 years ago, I would consider pretty benighted right now, because I just wasn't really aware of the problem, or at least had no concept of the depth of the problem. And
Yeah.
I don't know if it's that I've changed what I read, or if there really is a growing awareness of that problem. But things I never would have believed 5 or 10 years ago, I now take for granted.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I felt the same way, is that, I'm one of those privileged white males. And so of course I sail right through and I never noticed this stuff. And it was conversations with some of my colleagues, when I was, for instance, I'm sitting there talking to them about this really cool work that Dr. X over here is doing. And they all go quiet and they don't want to talk about it, because Dr. X, it turns out, has this problem that nobody wants to talk about, because he's basically a sexist asshole. And because I'm a guy, I don't see this sort of thing. And over the years, it's become increasingly obvious that I'm oblivious to a lot of this stuff, and I've tried to be more conscious of it. Um, and it's been a weird evolution on my part too. I'd say the same thing you did 5 years ago, I would have been clueless. I would have said, okay, there's a problem, get over it, right? Just
Yeah,
buckle down and get to work and do the science and you'll be fine. And nowadays I'm starting to realize how pervasive the problem is. And no, that's exactly what a white man would say. But
right.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I'm in the same boat, and I don't. It's not. I don't think I ever didn't believe there was a problem, but um, I certainly wasn't aware of how widespread a problem it was. And
yeah, and we tended to minimize it too, I think, is part of the problem.
sure,
Uh,
and I don't know if people are talking more about it now, or if I'm just listening to different people.
yeah, it's got to be a combination of the two. That uh, for instance, I was at a big HHMI meeting this past semester, and we were talking about, and this was a central topic of discussion, is how do we break these barriers? Because, in coming years, we need to recruit these people to be contributing to science. If you care about science, you've got to care about these issues. And that was kind of an eye opener for me, was sitting down with the granting agencies and discovering that they are intensely aware of this problem, and they want everyone to stop discriminating against minorities, against women, to give equal opportunities, because of the purely pragmatic concern that this is the coming generation of scientists, and we've got to keep that pool open and active and involved in the scientific community.
Yeah, I just this spring served on my first NSF panel, and obviously I can't say too much about
Right.
what went on there, but it was a topic that came up, and sort of at the end of it, they kind of summarized well, how many of the how many of the pre-proposals that we recommended to go for full proposals were from women? And in that case, we had done pretty well, but I'm sure in some cases it doesn't go that way.
Yeah, we've experienced the same thing when we've done job searches here. We just finished one this past year, and it's a weird thing because you're sitting there saying we've got to get the very best people, and people who are compatible with our university and our mission and all this sort of stuff. And yet at the same time, we're also saying, but there's this other parameter we have to consider, which is, are we getting representation from other groups? And sometimes those two collide and they don't work very well together. So it's very awkward because you can't set up a category and say, well, we're just going to hire women in this search. That doesn't work. Yeah. No. But on the other hand, the default is women or men tend to get hired more. So I wish there were a magic recipe that would solve all this problem. Actually, the magic recipe is out there. If the universities would be better funded so they could hire more faculty, then we'd be in good shape.
The resources weren't quite so scarce. You wouldn't have to be so picky about how to distribute.
Yeah, I would love to just say, okay, we're going to hire 3 new women for our department this year, because it would solve so many problems and it would be perfectly compatible with our mission. So, yeah.
Okay. Some of the things I've seen.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Some of the things I've seen work for some situations, but they wouldn't work for hiring. Like one of the meetings I was involved in recently, the abstracts had to be submitted in a particular format where only initials and last name were used rather than surnames. Mm-hmm. That's that's a small thing, but it kind of prevents some of the inherent biases that we're all subject to. Of course, the family names can tell you something about the person's background too. So it's not a perfect solution.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I only got my job because Myers is a common black family name in the South. No, that's not it. Really, I'm joking. Yeah, it's a problem we can't fix in our job interview process. You could imagine doing that with the paper applications. Right now, all of our applications go through our secretarial pool, and they present them to us. So you could imagine they could sit down and remove all the gender identification from these. But then you do the phone interviews. Sorry, we know who you are now.
Well, that's also only if nobody on the faculty or on the hiring committee has actually read some of these people's papers or seen them at a meeting or know who they are personally.
Yep, it's a very chummy sort of discipline. So, at a small university, fortunately, we're mainly drawing upon a diverse pool. So the fact that I know a lot of developmental biologists does not give me insight on applicants for our cell biology or our genetics position. Sure. But otherwise, yeah, it's, and seriously, when you get these applications, one of the things you do is you actually look up their papers and you look at what they're doing. And you may even Google them. And anonymity is not a viable thing when you're doing a job search.
Right. Yeah. Or really a grant application, because past performance is part of that equation as well. Part of the evaluation.
Yep. So I think the answer is that we just need to get rid of the old fogies. Yes, that's funny from me being 60 years old, but get rid of the old fogies and get a new generation up there that are a bit more open-minded about these sorts of things. And then maybe this will be a moot issue at that point, but it'll take a while to get to that point.
Yeah, it's a tough problem.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've been talking for a while. I'm going to stop this here. I'm kind of disappointed that we had a couple of other people who were going to show up, but maybe I'll just hit them up some other time. So we'll just close at this point. I'll post this on my blog and tell them where to go to read Fierce roller, right?
Yep, that's the one.
Yeah. Learn about evolution of multicellularity and all this other cool stuff. Okay, well, thanks very much. It's been fun talking to you. Let's do it again sometime.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah.